There is a city in Colombia where, on the day a man died, 25,000 people showed up to mourn him. They wept in the streets. They reached into his open casket to pull out strands of his hair as keepsakes. They called him a saint. They called him a father. They called him the one man who had ever truly cared about them. The government called him the most dangerous criminal who had ever lived. Both sides were telling the truth. Pablo Escobar, at the height of his power, was personally responsible for the deaths of over 4,000 people. He bombed a commercial airliner carrying 110 passengers. He declared open war on the Colombian state, assassinated presidential candidates, blew up police stations in residential neighborhoods, and once made an offer so audacious it barely sounds real. He told the Colombian government he would personally pay off the country's entire $10 billion national debt if they simply agreed to leave him alone. And for a period of time that should terrify anyone who thinks about it seriously, that offer was genuinely on the table. At his peak, Pablo Escobar was generating $60 million a day. His operation was so large, so deeply embedded into the infrastructure of an entire nation, that the people trying to stop him sometimes found themselves wondering whether stopping him was even possible, or whether the system had already been so thoroughly purchased that there was nothing left to stop him with. And yet, on December 2nd, 1993, Pablo Escobar died barefoot on a rooftop in Medellin, wearing jeans and a blue shirt, weighing 240 pounds, barely able to run. He had one bodyguard, one pistol, and a phone call he should have ended 14 minutes earlier. The man who had outrun governments, purchased generals, terrorized a democracy into rewriting its own constitution, and built an empire so vast that his accountants eventually gave up counting money and started weighing it instead, that man was brought down by a single moment of love for his son. But here's what the history books tend to skip over. The technology that tracked him, the soldiers who surrounded him, the intelligence that led them to that exact building on that exact street, none of it would have been enough on its own. Because somewhere inside Pablo's inner circle, someone who had sat at his table, eaten his food, and called him a brother had been feeding his location, his habits, and his vulnerabilities to the people hunting him. 4 months. This is not just the story of how Pablo Escobar died. This is the story of how he was built, what he became, why the world couldn't stop him through conventional means, and what it ultimately took, from the inside, to finally bring him down. To understand Pablo Escobar, you have to go back to a cemetery in Medellin in the early hours of a weekday morning, sometime around 1966. A 14-year-old boy is standing among the headstones with a crowbar. He's not there to grieve. He's there to work. Pablo had figured out that stolen headstones, the names sandblasted off and the stone resold, could earn him 5,000 pesos per piece. In today's money, that's the equivalent of roughly $500 per stone. 3 nights of grave robbing generated more income than his father earned in 6 months of honest labor. The margins were extraordinary. The risk was manageable. And the product was essentially infinite. But the real education didn't come from the theft. It came from the guard. The cemetery had a guard. His job, officially, was to prevent exactly what Pablo was doing. But Pablo quickly discovered that the guard wasn't stopping him, he was helping him. The guard was selling Pablo information, telling him which graves were freshest, which families had spent the most on their headstones, which sections of the cemetery were least monitored. The man whose entire purpose was to protect the place was the most useful criminal inside it. At 14 years old, Pablo Escobar absorbed a lesson that would define everything that came after. The systems society builds to protect itself are not neutral. They are operated by human beings with needs and fears and appetites. And human beings, under the right conditions, can be converted. The question isn't whether a system can be corrupted. The question is whether you understand it well enough to know which pressure points to push. Pablo understood this better than almost anyone who has ever lived. 2 years later, the lesson deepened. In 1974, 16-year-old Pablo was arrested for stealing a Renault 4. He was sitting in a Medellin police station facing 5 years in a Colombian prison when a senior officer named Luis Fernando Gomez walked in, closed the door behind him, and threatened to expose a family secret, something deeply personal, something that if made public would have caused Pablo's mother enormous shame and pain. The officer believed he had leverage. He was right. What he didn't understand was that Pablo was already thinking several moves ahead. Pablo negotiated. He offered Gomez 50,000 pesos up front and 1,000 pesos every month for the rest of his life. The officer accepted. Handshakes were exchanged. The deal was done. Except Pablo had a tape recorder hidden inside his jacket the entire time. He had recorded every word. The offer. The acceptance. The terms. From that moment forward, Officer Gomez was not an ally. He was property. Pablo didn't just own the man's silence, he owned the man. And that distinction matters enormously, because ownership is permanent in a way that bribery never is. A bribed man can always decide the next payment isn't worth the risk. An owned man has no such option. Within 6 months, Pablo had applied the same technique to 14 Medellin police officers. He filmed them accepting bribes. He recorded their confessions. He documented their crimes in meticulous detail. By the time he was 20 years old, Pablo Escobar had inverted the entire protection racket. He wasn't paying for safety. He was the one collecting safety payments. Cops called him before raids happened. Judges quietly buried warrants. Prison guards smuggled messages in and out. He had built a private intelligence network out of the city's law enforcement apparatus, and he hadn't spent a single peso he hadn't already taken back with interest. He had discovered the ultimate business model. Don't fight the law. Don't hide from it. Buy it, and then put it to work. There are 2 currencies in criminal enterprise. Money is the obvious one. The other is reputation, specifically, the reputation for being willing to do what others will only threaten. Pablo understood from a young age that reputation is not built slowly through consistent behavior. It is built through a single act so audacious, so disproportionate, so far outside what anyone expects, that it permanently redefines how people understand what you're capable of. The incident that built Pablo's early reputation happened on November 3, 1975. A local trafficker named Diego Montoya had kidnapped Pablo's cousin Gustavo and was demanding 3 million pesos in ransom. Pablo's response was nothing that anyone in the Medellin underworld had ever seen before. He walked into Montoya's compound. Alone. Unarmed. During his daughter's quinceañera celebration, with 200 guests present. He approached Montoya in front of everyone, leaned in close, whispered something in his ear, and then calmly turned around and walked back out. Within 10 minutes, Gustavo was released and Montoya had fled Colombia permanently, never to return. What did Pablo say? According to Montoya's widow, Pablo told him, "I've already killed your mother. She's in the trunk of your car. You have 10 minutes to check and run, or watch me kill your daughter next." Montoya's mother was, in fact, perfectly safe at home. Pablo had said something entirely false to create 10 minutes of absolute, consuming terror, 10 minutes during which Montoya's brain was overwhelmed by a single thought and could process nothing else. By the time the 10 minutes were up and Montoya might have begun to question the story, Pablo was already gone and Gustavo was already free. The lesson spread immediately through Medellin's criminal world. Pablo Escobar wasn't just willing to threaten things others wouldn't. He was willing to construct realities that didn't exist and weaponize them. He would do things others only talked about. And if he said something was going to happen, the cost of testing whether he was serious was simply too high to consider. That reputation, that specific quality of unpredictability combined with total follow-through, would become the most valuable asset Pablo ever owned. More valuable than any shipment. More valuable than any political connection. More valuable than the billions he would eventually accumulate. Because money can be seized and connections can be broken. But genuine, bone-deep fear of a man travels with him everywhere he goes. The cocaine opportunity didn't arrive through ambition or planning. It arrived through Pablo noticing an arithmetic error that someone else had made and was too comfortable to correct. In September 1976, Pablo was watching a mid-level smuggler named Fabio Restrepo count his earnings. 1 kilogram of raw cocaine paste could be purchased in Peru for $350. Restrepo was selling it in Medellin for $4,000. He believed this represented a 10 times return on investment and considered himself successful. Pablo did the calculation differently. That same kilogram, properly processed into refined cocaine and transported to Miami, returned $40,000 on the American market. Not 10 times. 114 times the original cost. Restrepo was voluntarily, cheerfully leaving 90% of his potential earnings on the table and calling himself a businessman. Pablo pointed this out. Restrepo laughed and asked whether Pablo thought just anyone could fly cocaine to America. Pablo didn't laugh. He was already calculating how many aircraft he would need and which routes were least monitored. Within 6 months, Restrepo was dead and Pablo controlled everything he had built. But even controlling routes wasn't the endgame Pablo was working toward. Routes can be disrupted. Planes can be seized. Individual smugglers are fragile single points of failure. Pablo wanted something structurally different, a system so deeply embedded and so broadly distributed that no single arrest, no single seizure, no single act of law enforcement could meaningfully damage it. The model came together, somewhat accidentally, when one of Pablo's planes went down in Panama with 600 kilograms of cocaine aboard. Local authorities seized the entire shipment. Pablo prepared for a total loss. Instead, General Manuel Noriega, one of Panama's most powerful military figures, contacted him directly with a proposition. For 10% of every shipment moving through Panamanian territory, Noriega would personally guarantee safe passage. Not just tolerance, active protection. Pablo sat with the implications of that offer for a moment. If he could purchase the cooperation of an entire government, not just individual officials, but a government, then the model was infinitely scalable. He had been buying individual police officers and judges for years. What Noriega was offering was the wholesale version of the same transaction. And if it worked in Panama, there was no geographic reason it couldn't work in Colombia, in Ecuador, in Mexico. In every country his product needed to pass through between the farms of Peru and the streets of American cities. At 26 years old, Pablo reportedly stood over a map of Latin America and told his cousin Gustavo something that sounded, at the time, like a delusion. Within 5 years, he said, he would control more real power than any government in South America. Gustavo thought he was joking. The frightening truth, which would only become clear in retrospect, is that Pablo was underestimating himself. The meeting that formally created what would become the Medellin cartel happened on June 6, 1978, at a coastal ranch belonging to a man named Carlos Leder. Pablo arrived with a proposal. Instead of competing against each other, fighting over routes, undercutting prices, losing product to rival seizures, the major traffickers should combine. Share planes. Share routes. Share the cost of bribing officials. Create, in effect, a cocaine monopoly that made every competitor either a customer or a corpse. Jorge Luis Ochoa agreed immediately. His brothers nodded along. But a man named Jose Gonzalo Rodriguez Gacha, known as El Mexicano, asked the question that the room had been quietly circling. Who decides who lives and who dies? Pablo's answer was delivered in 4 words, without hesitation and without apology. I do, he said. Within 3 years, that answer would be empirically, documentably true. By 1982, the numbers that Pablo's operation was producing had moved beyond the language that normal financial discussion uses. Every 72 hours, a single aircraft left Colombia carrying 1,000 kilograms of pure cocaine. Pablo owned 15 such aircraft. But the genius of what he had built wasn't simply the volume of product moving through his network, it was the structural position he had engineered for himself within it. He was charging other traffickers to use his routes. Every competitor had become, in effect, a paying customer. He wasn't just in the cocaine business. He had franchised the cocaine business and made himself the franchisor. The product moved whether he supervised it or not. The money arrived whether he was watching or not. He had built, in the most literal possible sense, a passive income stream denominated in tens of millions of dollars per week. By 1984, the daily revenue had reached $60 million. Weekly, it was approaching $500 million. The numbers are almost impossible to process until you understand what they translated to physically, because cash at that scale has a weight problem. $1 million in $20 bills weighs approximately 110 pounds. Pablo's operation was processing 40,000 pounds of cash every single month. Counting it was not feasible. His brother Roberto, who served as the operations accountant, eventually abandoned traditional bookkeeping entirely and switched to weighing the money instead. $1 million in mixed-denomination bills weighing consistently around 22 pounds, which was reliable enough for their purposes. Storage became the next problem. Pablo buried $800 million in plastic barrels in locations across Colombia. What nobody had accounted for, not Pablo, not Roberto, not any of the dozens of people managing the logistics, was that tropical humidity destroys paper currency within months. The moisture seeps in, the bills deteriorate, and entire fortunes simply decompose in the ground. Rats found their way into some of the containers and consumed an estimated $100 million in banknotes annually. When Roberto brought Pablo the accounting that showed $2 billion had been lost simply to storage failures, not to law enforcement, not to theft, not to any external force, but simply to nature, Pablo reportedly considered the number for a moment and then told Roberto to write it off. It was 10% of gross. The operation would replace it without noticing. There is something genuinely staggering about that moment. A $2 billion loss treated as an acceptable margin of error. Not with anger. Not with alarm. With a shrug and an instruction to the accountant. But someone had been watching those burial sites. Mapping the locations. Cataloging which barrels were in which fields, on which hillsides, under which trees. Waiting, with enormous patience, for exactly the right moment to use that information. Pablo's public image, the one that brought 25,000 people to his funeral, was built with the same cold precision he applied to everything else. It was not, despite how it appeared to those who benefited from it, generosity. It was infrastructure. The neighborhood of Barrio Pablo Escobar, 450 homes built for Medellin's homeless, is the example most often cited when people discuss Pablo's charitable work. What is less often mentioned is that Pablo filmed every family receiving their keys. He recorded their names. He documented their children's names and their faces. He knew where each family had come from and what they had before he gave them their home. These weren't gifts in any conventional sense. They were contracts. When police came to the neighborhood asking questions, those 450 families saw nothing. When Pablo needed crowds to appear at rallies or public events, 450 families materialized. He hadn't bought loyalty in the way that word is normally understood. He had manufactured dependency and then converted that dependency into a standing private militia disguised as a grateful community. The 70 football pitches he built across Medellin each contained hidden storage rooms beneath the stands. The basketball courts were constructed above tunnel networks. Every public amenity, every school supply donation, every Christmas toy distribution, each had a functional secondary purpose. The charity was real. The benefit to the recipients was real. But beneath the surface of every gift was architecture that served Pablo's operational needs. His political ambitions, however, produced the first real crack. In 1982, Pablo won election as an alternate congressman, which granted him legal immunity from prosecution. He attended one session of Congress, sat quietly at the back, and said almost nothing. But a justice minister named Rodrigo Lara Bonilla had been watching him. Something bothered Lara about the tax returns Pablo had filed. They claimed income from bicycle rental shops, but Pablo had arrived at the congressional session by private helicopter. Lara began investigating. On August 16, 1983, he stood before the full Colombian Congress and held up Pablo's 1976 arrest record for drug trafficking. In 30 seconds, Pablo Escobar went from elected official to publicly exposed criminal. The humiliation was, by all accounts, worse than any physical threat Pablo had ever faced. He offered Lara $5 million to retract the accusations publicly. Lara refused. The offer went to $10 million. Still refused. Pablo had encountered, perhaps for only the second time in his adult life, a man who could not be converted. Not through money. Not through fear. Not through any pressure Pablo knew how to apply. On April 30, 1984, Lara's Mercedes was sprayed with machine gun fire. 7 bullets struck the minister. He was dead before the car stopped moving. Within 72 hours of Lara's assassination, DEA aircraft had landed in Bogota carrying a capability Pablo had no framework for understanding: satellite surveillance technology capable of reading a vehicle's license plate from space. The rules of the conflict had fundamentally changed, and Pablo was not yet aware of it. What followed was not a drug war in the conventional sense. It was something more like a systematic campaign to make normal life in Colombia impossible until the government capitulated to Pablo's terms. The logic was explicit and deliberate. For every official who refused to accept a bribe, Pablo's formula held that 7 people in that official's life would become targets. Not the official alone. His father. His brother. His wife. And then the official himself, last, after watching everyone around him disappear. Judge Gustavo Zuluaga rejected Pablo's money in January 1989. His father died on the 10th of that month. His brother died on the 18th. His wife died on the 26th. The judge himself died on February 3rd. 4 deaths over 24 days, each one a demonstration of the sequence Pablo had designed and would execute without deviation. By the end of 1989, Pablo's hired killers had murdered 657 police officers, 47 judges, 3 presidential candidates, 1 attorney general, 1 justice minister. He announced a weekly lottery of death. Every Friday, 10 randomly selected police officers across different Colombian cities would be killed. No advance warning. No specific targets named in advance. Simply a standing guarantee that 10 officers would die each Friday until the government's position changed. By the 6th week, officers across the country were refusing to wear their uniforms in public. By the 10th week, entire police precincts were reporting sick en masse. The tactic wasn't designed to kill as many officers as possible. It was designed to make being a police officer feel like a form of suicide, and in that goal it was devastatingly effective. The most psychologically sophisticated weapon Pablo deployed, however, wasn't violence at all. It was surveillance. He maintained detailed files on every significant government official, their daily routines, their romantic relationships, their children's school schedules, their parents' medical conditions, their financial situations. A prosecutor named Monica Delgado discovered one morning that Pablo knew she visited her father's grave every Sunday at 3 o'clock in the afternoon. She found fresh flowers at the grave with a handwritten note attached. The note said, "These could have been for you." A general received increasingly expensive birthday presents for his daughter 3 years running, each gift more elaborate than the last. No threatening note accompanied any of them. The message was delivered entirely through the act of giving. I know your child's birthday. I know where she lives. I know what she likes. I have been watching your family for years. And I am patient enough to watch for years more. The Palace of Justice siege in November 1985 revealed something about Pablo that even his closest associates found difficult to fully absorb. He paid the M19 guerrilla group $2 million to storm Colombia's Supreme Court, specifically to destroy extradition case files and eliminate the judges associated with them. But the siege's inner logic went further than the files. As the Colombian military surrounded the building and the situation deteriorated, fires broke out on the upper floors, fires that may not have been accidental. Hostages faced a choice between burning and jumping. 11 Supreme Court justices died, not in crossfire between guerrillas and soldiers, but in the flames. Pablo monitored the assault through radio frequencies, reportedly tracking the progression of the fire floor by floor. The kidnapping campaign that followed was Pablo's most direct demonstration of what he was willing to do to a functioning democracy. He abducted 23 journalists and delivered a video to Colombian news stations. His voice, disguised but recognizable to those who knew it, presented a simple ultimatum. The government had 48 hours to formally ban extradition from the Colombian Constitution. For every day beyond that deadline, 2 hostages would be executed. The timer started. At hour 36, Congress convened an emergency session. At hour 47, lawmakers voted to amend the Constitution and ban extradition. Pablo Escobar had forced the democratic government to rewrite its foundational legal document under threat of murder. The people who voted that day did so knowing the alternative. And they voted anyway, because the alternative was unthinkable. The surrender that Colombia's government believed it had negotiated in 1991 was, in reality, a business decision. Pablo had agreed to submit to incarceration on a set of terms so extraordinary that what he actually agreed to was a change of address. La Catedral, the facility built to Pablo's personal specifications on a hillside outside Medellin, was a prison in name only. Pablo had chosen the location. He had approved the architectural plans. He had personally selected which guards would be assigned to the facility. The amenities included a football pitch, a bar, a jacuzzi, guest accommodations, and a view of the city that Pablo had lived in his entire life. Visitors arrived and departed with minimal scrutiny. Pablo conducted business, held meetings, and ran his operation from inside without meaningful interruption. 10 days into his imprisonment, he hosted what he described to authorities as a reconciliation summit. 22 of Colombia's most significant traffickers arrived at La Catedral believing they were attending a negotiation over territory and business arrangements. What Pablo presented instead was a series of files, detailed, comprehensive dossiers on each man's operations, their suppliers, their banking arrangements, their routes, their personnel. The message was straightforward. From this point, Pablo explained, each of them would be working within his network and paying him 30% of gross revenue. Anyone who declined could expect their file to be on a DEA agent's desk by morning. No one declined. In a single afternoon, from inside a prison he had designed himself, Pablo Escobar had completed a hostile takeover of the entire Colombian trafficking industry. He was generating more money as a prisoner than he ever had as a free man. The arrangement collapsed in July 1992, and the collapse was entirely self-inflicted. Two of Pablo's lieutenants, Fernando Galeano and Gerardo Moncada, arrived at La Catedral carrying $20 million in cash, a tax payment owed to Pablo from their operations. Pablo's paranoia, which had been intensifying for months, convinced him that they were stealing from him. There was no evidence of this. The accounting, by every account, was accurate. But Pablo had reached a psychological state where suspicion had become indistinguishable from certainty, and where the gap between believing something and acting on it had essentially disappeared. What happened in La Catedral's game room over the following 6 hours was so extreme that members of Pablo's own security detail were, by multiple accounts, physically sick from witnessing it. Pablo tortured Galeano for 6 hours before killing him. Moncada was forced to watch his partner die before being hanged from the facility's football goal. The bodies were subsequently dismembered and disposed of in the facility's pizza oven. A guard's girlfriend overheard him weeping while describing what he had seen, and the story spread. President Cesar Gaviria faced an impossible choice. Acknowledging what had happened inside La Catedral meant admitting that the Colombian government had built Pablo Escobar a private criminal headquarters and staffed it with guards he controlled. On July 21, 1992, 400 soldiers surrounded the facility with orders to transfer Pablo immediately to a conventional secure facility. Pablo wasn't worried. He had been anticipating this moment for months. The tunnel exit had been prepared. His men were already in position beyond the perimeter with vehicles. He made a phone call to his mother, told her he was leaving, and entered the tunnel with 8 men. They crawled 200 meters through darkness and emerged in forest beyond the army's lines. What Pablo didn't know, couldn't have known, was that the DEA had installed infrared cameras covering his exact exit point the previous day. His emergence from the tunnel, the direction he moved, the vehicles that collected him, all of it was watched from the moment he appeared above ground. From that night forward, Pablo Escobar would never be truly unobserved again. The photograph that began the final phase of Pablo's destruction was taken at his daughter Manuela's 9th birthday party on July 24, 1992, 2 days after his escape from La Catedral. Pablo, desperate to maintain some thread of normalcy for his children despite everything, had risked attending. Hidden photographers captured him embracing his daughter. Within hours, the image was in the hands of Los Peeps, a shadowy organization whose name stood for people persecuted by Pablo Escobar, and whose methods mirrored Pablo's own with uncomfortable precision. Los Peeps didn't just study Pablo in the photograph. They identified every person visible in the background. Every cousin, every friend, every child who had attended the party. Each of them became a target. The executions began within days. Pablo's cousin Carlos Alzate was the first, found with his eyes removed and a message attached to the body. The woman who had catered the party was burned alive inside her restaurant. A man whose son had attended received his child's school uniform on his doorstep, riddled with bullet holes, a warning precise enough to convert him immediately into an informant. Within 6 months, Los Peeps had killed 187 people who had appeared in birthday party photographs. Pablo's network of loyal allies, which had once numbered in the thousands, had contracted to 5 frightened bodyguards who understood clearly that they were already dead men. The only question was timing. What terrified Pablo most was not the killings themselves. It was what Los Peeps seemed to know. They located safe houses Pablo had purchased under entirely fabricated identities. They found bank accounts opened in his mother's maiden name, accounts that virtually no one outside Pablo's immediate family knew existed. They intercepted communications using codes that only his brother Roberto had created. The information they were acting on could not have come from surveillance technology or conventional intelligence work. It was too specific, too intimate, too consistently accurate. Someone inside Pablo's closest circle was talking. Pablo responded the only way he knew how, with paranoia and violence. He ordered polygraph examinations for every member of his personal security detail. He executed 2 bodyguards for failing loyalty questions. He began rotating locations daily, sometimes twice daily, trusting almost no one with his next destination until minutes before he moved. The leaks continued regardless, because the person responsible for them was not someone Pablo had flagged as a potential threat. It was someone he trusted completely. Someone who had sat at his table for years, who knew every safe house and every escape route, who understood Pablo's habits and routines and psychological vulnerabilities better than almost any person alive. That person had watched what happened to Galeano and Moncada at La Catedral. Had watched other lieutenants disappear over imagined slights and paranoid accusations. Had done the arithmetic that everyone around Pablo was privately doing, calculating the probability of surviving in Pablo's orbit long enough to die of natural causes, and had reached the obvious conclusion. Survival required switching sides before Pablo decided, on whatever evidence his deteriorating judgment required, that they were next. The contact with Los Peeps was made. The offer was straightforward: Pablo's location, his habits, his vulnerabilities, in exchange for guaranteed safe passage and the reward money the Colombian government had placed on his head. Every perfectly coordinated raid, every intercepted communication, every safe house raided within hours of Pablo's departure. All of it flowed from that one source, sitting at Pablo's table, watching him eat, listening to him plan, and quietly transmitting everything to the people hunting him. What the traitor's intelligence was working alongside, and what Pablo had no framework for comprehending, was a surveillance capability that had never been deployed against a single criminal target before. The NSA's Centro Spike program had positioned a specialized aircraft above Medellin that flew at 20,000 feet, invisible to the radar systems Pablo's security detail monitored. The aircraft could intercept any radio frequency being used in the city. It could break through any scrambler technology available on the commercial or criminal market. It could pinpoint the source of any electronic emission, any phone call, any radio transmission, any computerized communication, to within 100 meters. Every time Pablo pressed a button on a radio, dialed a phone number, or sent a message through any electronic channel, Centro Spike logged the event, located the source, and transmitted coordinates to search block ground units in real time. Pablo believed he was hiding in Medellin's urban sprawl, a city of millions, a labyrinth of neighborhoods and buildings and alleyways that he had known since childhood. What he was actually doing, each time he communicated, was tightening an electronic cage around himself. The city wasn't hiding him. It was containing him. And the cage shrank a little every time he spoke. On November 26, 1993, Pablo made the mistake that began the final countdown. His son Juan Pablo, who had been attempting to secure asylum in various countries and had been turned away by every embassy approached, called his father in tears. He was trapped in Colombia. He was frightened. He needed help. Pablo stayed on the phone for 8 minutes, 7 minutes longer than his own security protocols absolutely required him to hang up. He promised to arrange visas. He swore they would be together by Christmas. Centro Spike triangulated the call to a 6-block radius in the Los Olivos neighborhood. Search block flooded the area. Pablo escaped, but barely, leaving behind his favorite pistol and a notebook containing what appeared to be a draft of his last will and testament. He knew, at that point, that the circle was closing. The question was no longer whether it would close, but how much time remained before it did. December 1st, 1993. Pablo's 44th birthday. He was hiding in a middle-class row house in Medellin, reduced to a single bodyguard, a man named Alvaro Limón Aguilar, known as El Limón. No celebrations. No visitors. No cake. Pablo spent his birthday listening to a transistor radio, hearing the Colombian government announce a $6 million reward for information leading to his capture or death. He reportedly laughed at the number. He had once spent that amount on a single party. His mother was surrounded by government agents around the clock. Every word she spoke was recorded. She prayed for her son publicly and told journalists, in what must have been the most painful statement of her life, that she wished he had never been born. Pablo couldn't call her. Couldn't send word. Couldn't know what she was thinking or whether she was safe. December 2nd, 1993. Early afternoon. Juan Pablo called again. The German embassy might accept a bribe to process asylum documentation. There were details to discuss, arrangements to make, specifics that required Pablo's direct input. Pablo's security protocol was absolute on one point: no call longer than 30 seconds. 30 seconds was the threshold below which triangulation was not feasible with the technology available to search block. 30 seconds and hang up, regardless of what was being discussed, regardless of who was on the line. Juan Pablo was crying. 1 minute passed. Then 2. Then 5. Then 10. Pablo was making promises. Talking about Christmas. Describing what their reunion would look like. His son's voice, frightened and young on the other end of the line, made hanging up feel like abandonment. Made the 30-second protocol feel like a choice to leave his child alone in a dangerous country with no protection and no plan. At 14 minutes and 23 seconds, Centro Spike achieved perfect triangulation. Not a neighborhood. Not a block. A specific building. A specific floor. Colonel Martinez dispatched everything simultaneously. Ground units approaching from multiple directions. Helicopters taking positions above the roofline. Snipers establishing sight lines on adjacent rooftops. Pablo finally registered the sound of boots on the stairs, the unmistakable thunder of a coordinated breach, moving fast and with purpose. He dropped the phone. Juan Pablo, still on the line in a hotel room somewhere else in the city, heard gunfire erupt. He heard his father shouting a single instruction, "Limón, the window," and then the sound of glass breaking, and then more gunfire, and then nothing. Pablo and El Limon crashed through a second-floor window onto the roof. Pablo was barefoot. He weighed 240 pounds. He had not, for months, had access to the kind of food or exercise that had once made him physically formidable. El Limon sprinted ahead, firing upward at the helicopters positioning above them. 3 bullets struck him nearly simultaneously, chest, neck, and head. He fell 12 feet from Pablo and did not move again. Pablo was alone on the rooftop tiles, surrounded by riflemen on every adjacent surface. He raised his Sig Sauer pistol and managed 2 shots before bullets tore through his leg and torso. He staggered, still trying to aim, still trying to find a target. Sergeant Hugo Aguilar, positioned on a rooftop 40 meters away, centered the crosshairs of his Gallo rifle. The fatal shot entered above Pablo's right ear at 3:15 and 47 seconds on the afternoon of December 2, 1993. The photograph of search block officers posing with Pablo's body, triumphant, grinning, arranged around his corpse like hunters with a trophy, reached government offices in Washington before Pablo's family had been officially notified of his death. Colombia's government declared an unconditional victory. Flags were raised. Officials gave speeches. The justice system, they said, had prevailed. 25,000 people attended Pablo Escobar's funeral. The crowd that gathered was not made up of criminals celebrating one of their own. It was made up of people from the neighborhoods where Pablo had built homes and football pitches and basketball courts. People who had received keys to houses, who had watched their children play on fields he funded, who had experienced, whatever the architecture beneath it, something that felt, to them, like someone finally seeing them. Those people wept at his graveside and reached into his casket to take pieces of him home. Within 6 weeks of his death, the reality beneath the victory became impossible to ignore. The Cali cartel had absorbed Pablo's supply routes overnight, moving with a speed and efficiency that suggested they had been preparing for this moment for some time. Cocaine shipments to the United States did not decrease. They increased. By 1994, Colombia's drug war had not ended. It had simply reorganized around a new center of gravity. And the person who had sold Pablo's location, who had sat at his table, eaten his food, used his codes, and transmitted his vulnerabilities to the people hunting him, was alive. Identity protected, under the terms of agreements made with both Colombian and American intelligence. Declassified DEA documents eventually confirmed what investigators had long suspected. The betrayal had come from within Pablo's most trusted operational circle. Someone who had watched what happened to Galeano and Moncada in La Catedral. Someone who understood, with clarity, that Pablo's paranoia had temporarily prevented him from seeing that there was no loyalty Pablo wouldn't eventually overcome with fear. Someone who chose survival over allegiance, and succeeded. The phone calls Pablo made to his family in those final weeks weren't merely tracked by satellite technology circling above the city. Someone was telling his hunters precisely when he would be emotionally unable to hang up. Which calls would go long. Which moments his guard would fall. The man who had built an empire on the principle that every human being has a pressure point, a place where they will abandon their principles if the right force is applied to the right area, was destroyed by exactly that principle, applied to himself. Pablo Escobar's story is not, ultimately, a story about crime or drugs or violence or even money, though it contains all of those things in extraordinary quantities. It is a story about what happens when one person understands human weakness better than almost anyone around them, and then, inevitably, encounters the limits of that understanding in themselves. The man who couldn't be bought, couldn't be threatened, and couldn't be caught for 20 years was finally caught because he couldn't hang up on his crying son. In the end, The only thing that could reach Pablo Escobar was love. And the people hunting him knew exactly when to call.